want to start, before I even give a question, just giving my respect and gratitude to Senator Murphy. In Isaiah, it talks about those who wait on the Lord, running and not getting weary, walking and not being faint. And I just see the consistency of his efforts, which is not just manifest during this filibuster, which he has been on his feet now for 8.5 hours. It's just not today, but Senator Murphy, in his maiden speech here in the Senate, stood right there. I know this because at that time I was still mayor of the city of Newark, and gave, still to this day, for me, of all the Senate speeches I've heard, probably one of the most eloquent, moving, factual, compelling speeches on gun violence that I have heard. I am grateful today because just yesterday in a caucus meeting that I think my colleagues that are here will agree got very heated, very emotional, in which he spoke with passion, as did other colleagues, that he and I began talking about making sure that this was not business as usual, that we didn't go through the same routines in this body every single time there's a mass shooting. And there are mass shootings with greater and greater routine. And you've heard it from my colleagues. It is an insufficient response that our elected leaders should simply pray and share condolences. To paraphrase one of my heroes, who picture stands on my wall, Frederick Douglass, who said, "I prayed for years for my freedom, but I was still a slave. It wasn't until I prayed with my hands and prayed with my feet that I found my salvation." Faith without works is dead. Prayer is not enough. And so I stand here first and foremost to Senator Murphy and just express my gratitude. We talked during the day, we talked into the night, and chose to be here. I'm grateful for his senior senator who has been here for the entire duration. These two partners from Connecticut who went through the unimaginable when they shared the grief of a community where child after child after child, 20 children gunned down and murdered. These two men have been dedicated and determined, not yielding, not giving up, not surrendering to cynicism about government or this body, but continuing to fight and fight and fight so that we would do something about this problem. And so the first question I have for Senator Murphy, this idea that is deep within the history of our nation, that when there is injustice, and there is no greater injustice than the savage murder of our fellow citizens, of murder of innocence. I've seen you time and time again, and today is a model of courage as well as a model of endurance. To take a Senate that was prepared to move on, a Senate that was prepared to go on with business after the greatest, largest mass killing in this nation's history, we were going to go on with business as usual. So my conversations into the night last night, where I saw the determination of Senator Murphy not to let the business as usual go on in this Senate. So I have a number of questions for you, but the first one, Senator Murphy, is there are a lot of people who are surrendering to cynicism about government. A lot of people who are showing frustration. But yet you're still going on this in a way that reflects those people who didn't give up on the idea of civil rights in the 1940s and the 1950s and kept pushing legislation before the 1965 Voting Rights Act, before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, before the consciousness of the country caught up. But this must be frustrating to you. I've been here for 2.5 years. You've been here longer. And so we came here today for a reason. I say today because we're approaching the ninth hour, about a hour away from the ninth hour. Can you just frame one more time why you are expending your energy doing this now, here, in the Senate, especially because I know that perhaps there are people talking about, hey, well, they don't have a shot. They don't have a chance. There are cynics. There are critics. There are pundits probably saying, hey, they may not get a vote. People putting forth that, hey, the majority of Americans, majority gun owners, majority NRA members might agree with Senator Murphy, but hey, the NRA has too much of a hold on the United States Senate. Why are you here right now doing this on this day?
I thank the Senator, and I want to thank Senator Booker and Senator Blumenthal for being here from the very beginning. I mean, this has been miraculous in its own regard, not just being able to spend this time with the two of you, but to have had the majority of our caucus come down to this floor and express their support for our determination to move forward this debate, to at the very least get votes, but really try to bring consensus around this issue. And Senator Booker, I don't think I'm breaking confidences to share that both he and I spoke at our meeting yesterday of Democrats, in which Senator Booker shared just an immensely powerful series of stories about his experience as mayor of a grief-torn city, his direct personal intersection with friends, with neighbors who had lost their life. I know how deeply personally affected he has been. And I guess I tell you why I'm doing this as maybe a means of telling you why Senator Blumenthal and I are doing this. And I tell it through the prism of a story from that just awful series of days following the shooting in Sandy Hook. Senator Blumenthal and I went to the first of what were umpteen wakes and funerals. And we were standing in line at the first wake, about to talk to the first set of parents who had lost, in this case, their young daughter. And I remember being so uncertain about what we were supposed to say to these parents. I mean, not just what you were supposed to say to provide some measure of condolence, but we were their elected representatives. We had some additional obligation to show them that we were ready to act, but was it too soon to make that offer? Right? Was it not the right moment to suggest that there was a public policy response to the slaughter of their children? It was Senator Blumenthal that very gently and appropriately said to the mother and father as we walked by the closed casket, that said to the mother and father, whenever you're ready, we'll be there to fight. And the father said, we're ready now. We're ready now. This was probably not 48 hours after the death of their 6 or 7-year-old daughter. And so we've been thinking about this necessity, this imperative of action since that moment. And it gets harder and harder to look into the eyes of those parents, of those surviving children, and explain to them why this body has not acted. It gets harder and harder to defend the complete silence from this institution in the face of murder after murder. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't confident that everything that he proposed was going to solve the economic crisis of the 1930s and 1940s, but he was damned if he wasn't going to try something. He and his aides talked unabashedly and unapologetically about trial and error. We try one thing, if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. Why don't we do that? Why don't we try one thing, and if it doesn't stem the violence, try something else? But doing nothing is an abomination, and it makes it impossible for those of us who have lived through these tragedies to look these families in the eye. I remember that it took 10 years from the attempted assassination of President Reagan and the maiming of his press secretary, James Brady, for the Brady handgun bill to be signed into law. It took a decade of political action, and it took probably many nights like this when legislators or advocates stood out at a rally, maybe stood on the floor of the Senate or the House and argued until they had no more energy left, knowing that they weren't going to get the victory the next day. And as I've said to my friends in the movement back in Connecticut and throughout the country, and as I know as you've said versions of this as well, every great change movement is defined by the moments of failure, not the moments of success. Right? Every great change movement in this country is defined by the fact that there were times at which you could have given up, you could have hung it up, and you didn't. You persisted. The changes that never happened are the ones where the movement, once they hit that brick wall, said it's too hard, enough, and they went home. And so, Senator Booker, that's the reason why we're here, and I think I'm speaking for, in some way, shape, or form, for the three of us. We want to get votes on these measures. And we'll stand here until we get those votes. But even if we don't, it's important to continue to engage in the fight.
And so that's the first part of the framing that is very important. This determination that we will not do business as usual, that this fight will not stop. We will take this fight to the Senate floor. We will take this fight to legislatures. We will take this fight to neighborhoods and communities, and it's not a physical fight. It is a fight, in my opinion, of love. It is a fight that says we can be a country that affirms people's right to own weapons. We heard from one of our closest friends in the Senate, Senator Murphy, Senator Heinrich, who is an ardent gun owner. He's a hunter. Sometimes as a vegan, I got to watch his pictures of the things he's shot and killed. And he takes great pride and joy. What we are talking about, and this gets to be the next area of questioning, is nothing about hunters. It's nothing about people who want guns for self-defense. This is not about people who want guns because they love the sport. Senator Bennett took me out skeet shooting when I was in Colorado. It's not about folks who want the guns for that. This is about something very narrow. And that's the question I have, which is the second part of this framing, because while I've heard tonight some people talk about this in partisan terms, the truth of the matter is, while that may be partisanship in Washington speak, when I go back to New Jersey, I go to communities like the ones I grew up in, a majority Republican community, communities like the ones I live in Newark, majority Democrat, and I hear the same thing from people on both sides of the aisle. There is a lack of understanding in this country how we can be at this point where we have a nation that is at war with terrorists, where you have our enemy in places like Iraq and Syria literally saying, go to America, trying to egg on, trying to radicalize young people, instructing them, Al-Qaeda and others, instructing them that this is the country to go to buy guns. Because it's so easy to circumvent the law, not circumvent the law, but it's so easy to get access to guns because of these massive loopholes. And that's the point that brings us here, is you and I probably share beliefs about gun safety that are not shared by maybe the majority of gun owners. And there are things I've heard brought up tonight, frankly, that, hey, I might like. There's people talked about magazines. People talked about research on this. I've heard a lot of subjects brought up, but what brought you to the floor, what brought Senator Blumenthal to the floor tonight for the whole day, Senator Blumenthal has been here almost 9 hours, what's had me standing with you this entire time, is because it's this narrow look to say, hey, we as Americans can agree that terrorists, someone who is a suspected terrorist, that's under investigation, that might be on a no-fly list, that person should not be able to buy not just a weapon or a handgun, but an assault rifle. And when you look at this issue, it is not controversial with America. This is not controversial with Republicans. This is not controversial with NRA members, because the overwhelming majority of them agree that we should not be a country where a person can't get on a plane in Newark, New Jersey, but they can drive to a private seller or a gun show or go on the internet and buy a gun. The second of the three questions I have, sir, is this is not a radical thing that you're asking for. You're not calling for something that is controversial. This is something that at this point, it's common sense, and it is agreed upon by over 70% of gun owners. I'm not sure if there is an elected official in the Senate that has a 70+% approval rating. Rarely do you see people agree that greatly. So to me, could you please explain why you're taking a stand on this issue right now and what it is you think we should be able to achieve on this common ground for the common good?
I appreciate the Senator talking about what a limited ask we are making here. Let's talk about the scope of the limitation on gun ownership. We are asking that for people that are on a terrorist watch list, people that are on the no-fly list, that they be added to those that are prohibited from buying guns. Now, we have data that tells us how many of those individuals are buying guns every year, because we can match one list to the other, even though they don't intersect in a way that prohibits the purchase. And what we know is that there's only about 200 sales at gun stores every year from people that are on those lists. So we are talking about a minuscule limitation on the right, which is to take a small handful of individuals who have been placed on a terror no-fly list and saying that they shouldn't be able to get a weapon, and building into it a process to grieve that limitation so that if there is a mistake that's made, that you can have your right restored. But we're talking about a few hundred sales a year. Now, you can say, oh, it's a few hundred sales. Well, why does that matter? Well, you get it wrong once, and it's mass slaughter. So it's a small number of sales, a minuscule limitation, with potentially enormous reward when it comes to public safety.
I said one more question, but I'd like to do two more questions, because this is a sort of progression here. You're here today because of a commitment you have made from your maiden speech here in the United States Senate, Senator Murphy. A consistent belief that you will never give up until we have common sense gun safety in America. And that after a grievous act like we saw in Florida, where 49 innocent people were slaughtered, you, Senator Blumenthal, myself, and countless senators, at least half of our caucus who've come down here have said the same thing. Enough is enough. We can't let business as usual happen. Number two, what's being asked for, ultimately, the reason why you stood up and have been holding the floor for 9.5 hours, is in order to say, hey, the terrorist loophole should be closed. But there's one more element to this progression. An indefatigable senator, a non-controversial element, and now, in terms of the terrorist loophole, but now this other piece, which is just common sense. I want to take that one step and ask you to go a little deeper with it. And that last step is that in order, if you just have the terrorist loophole closed, but you don't have universal background checks. In other words, if you close the terrorist loophole so that anybody goes through to a federal firearm license dealer and goes to a NICS check, that stops that terrorist. But if you still have these internet sales and still have these private sales, that terrorist, who probably don't even go to that federal firearm licensee, they're going to go to the back doors that are still wide open for people to get guns. And so what you're saying is, I'm not giving up. Number two, 70+% of NRA members agree with me on what I'm asking for. And this last step, where still the majority of gun owners in America agree, why is it important also to make sure that if we want to stop terrorists from doing what they did in Orlando, which if we do nothing, it will happen, God forbid, but it may happen again. Why is this universal background check element the second thing that you are standing up for today, along with your colleagues?
When I go to bed at night, Senator Booker, I lock the front door and I lock the back door. right? It doesn't do much good to only lock the back door and leave the front door open, or vice versa, right? And so that's what we're proposing, is to make sure that if we believe in a commitment to stop individuals who are associated with terrorists from buying guns, then you have to lock both doors. You have to stop them from buying guns when they walk into a bricks and mortar store, but then you have to acknowledge that it is frankly easier for individuals to just type in one of the main online arms sellers and buy a weapon that way, because it's faster, it can get delivered right to your door, and you don't have to go through a background check. And so if you really want to make a commitment to preventing terrorists from getting guns, then you've got to do both. You have got to put them on the list, and then you have got to reconcile the fact that 40% of sales today are happening outside of that pathway. And by the way, the added benefit of that is that you are shutting down the pathway that criminals have been using for a decade in order to get these weapons. And you will have a dramatic effect on the slaughter that's happening in our cities as well by limiting the flow of illegal arms into those cities.
So if you'll pause for the last question, and I know that your senior senator would like to have a question, but this is where I have to say it becomes deeply personal to me. Because what you're talking about there, your persistent, unyielding fight for common sense gun legislation from the second you walked into the United States Senate, to the non-controversial idea that terrorists in America, people that are suspected of terrorists, should not be allowed to buy assault weapons, period. And your comment that that affects a very small universe of people, that in order to make that ironclad, again, nothing's ironclad, nothing's going to stop everybody, but this is doing something that will constrict access to terrorists. You've got to do a universal background check, so you close the back door, as you're saying. Now, this is what gets personal to me, even more so than all of this, because it's more than this, so it's more personal. When you do that, you are not affecting sports people. You're not affecting Second Amendment right believers who believe that I need to have my right to bear arms. You're not affecting folks that are worried about self-defense and want to have a gun to defend themselves. Who you are affecting when you do that is not just terrorists, but you actually have a collateral benefit when you tighten up the system, that you then stop criminals of all categories from getting guns. We live in a nation where women are victims of violence at astonishing rates. You close down that system for terrorists, you're going to make it much harder for someone who seeks to engage in domestic violence with a firearm. You're going to shut down their access. You're going to shut down criminals from getting guns. And this is what really I experienced as a United States mayor. I looked at all of my shootings and murders as too many in Newark when I was mayor. And I could only find one case where a law-abiding citizen used a gun in the kind of violence. What the problem we saw overwhelmingly in our city was that criminals who should have been stopped were using these loopholes to buy lots of weapons and engage in criminal activity. That so much of the carnage in our communities is happening when criminals can easily get access to guns. And so you and I have had this conversation privately so many times. I've sat with you in Connecticut cities. We've seen the impact and the pain and the agony of murder after murder after murder after murder in our cities. And this common sense terrorist loophole closing, would you please explain how that will also constrict the ability for all criminals committing murders at rates not seen anywhere on the planet Earth, because someone who has restrictions on them for buying guns, for being domestic violence, stalking, threatening a woman can go get a gun. Somebody who is an ex-con for a violent crime can still get a gun. Why is this important? Also because of the collateral benefits that would come about from this common sense constricting and closing of the terrorist loophole.
So, Senator Booker, there's nobody better than you than making people understand the human consequences of inaction. and the potential for human benefit of action. So I'm not going to try to compete. Let me give you the statistics. Let me tell you what happens in states that impose rigorous systems of background checks. There are 64% fewer guns trafficked out of state. There are 48% fewer firearm suicides. There are 48% fewer police killed by handguns. There are 46% fewer women who are shot to death by intimate partners. And there are 17% fewer aggravated assaults with guns. And those numbers would be even better if there was a national commitment to the same concept, because as Senator Durbin has told us, as tough as Illinois' laws are, all it takes is for a criminal to go across the border into Indiana and buy up guns at a gun show, or buy them online, or get them from an unregulated dealer and bring them back into Chicago. And what every police chief will tell you is that the fewer illegal guns on the street, the fewer crimes there are. The harder you make it for an individual at a moment of passion or a moment of frustration or whatever that moment may be to get a gun, the less likely you are to have a homicide. And so, you know, Senator Blumenthal and I went to a meeting of activists on this issue in Hartford, Connecticut, about a few weeks after the Newtown shooting. And they were furious. They were furious that the world had woken up to gun violence because of Newtown, after it had been a reality for them for so long. And so that is the genius of what we're proposing. Without taking away any Second Amendment rights, Senator Booker, we are able, with this proposal, to both extend protections to Americans that might be the victim of a terror attack, but also individuals who right now are living with the everyday slaughter that happens in our cities. I'd be happy to yield to my friend from Connecticut for a question without relinquishing the floor.
Senator Murphy's very eloquent reference to the family whom we met just a day or so after the loss of their child brings back a memory that always evokes an almost indescribable emotion for me. My heart goes to my throat whenever I think of that couple saying to me, "We're ready now, ready to help, ready to take action." And that has been the story of the Newtown and Sandy Hook families that lived through that loss. They came here and told their story to our colleagues, nearly achieved or helped us achieve a victory. We came within 4 or 5 votes of that outcome. And from the gallery of the chamber when we failed came the cry, shame. And it was indeed shameful that the Senate failed to move forward. My colleague from New Jersey, Senator Booker, has described the real-world impact in such graphic, powerful terms that I hesitate to follow him. But I want to make 2 points and ask my colleague from Connecticut whether he agrees with them. The first is that those families from Connecticut, in a sense, represented the community as a whole. And the Newtown community, the Connecticut community, through organizations like Sandy Hook Promise and the Newtown Action Alliance and others around the country, Everytown, Moms Demand Action, Americans for a Responsible Solution, they are doing what opponents of sensible common sense measures have done for much longer, which is to organize and to galvanize and educate and raise awareness. And that, in the end, will be the way we win. I pay tribute to them tonight. I thank them and the families for their courage and strength again. And I want to bring this issue home to Connecticut, where my friend and colleague, Senator Murphy, and I live, and where we went through the searing experience of the Newtown tragedy. I had been involved for 2 decades in gun violence prevention, helping to advocate and then to defend in court our ban on assault weapon, one of the first state laws in the country. But that experience transformed many of us in our state, and it impacted people of all ages to be more vigorous advocates and more articulate advocates. I want to read a letter from a young man who lives in Danbury, Connecticut. I am a constituent of yours, and I became a victim of gun violence when my 7-year-old cousin, Daniel Barton, was murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012. I am no longer, quote, saddened, end quote, by recent mass shooting. I am instead angry and frustrated by the inaction of this nation's leaders to implement obvious and basic safeguards to gun ownership, such as universal background check, CDC research into gun violence, limiting magazine capacity, restriction of gun ownership to domestic abusers and people on terrorist watch lists, to name a few. One of the most infuriating aspects of the continued mass shootings in this country is that they are so eminently preventable. We can't do much about earthquakes or hurricanes, but it is pretty simple to just not sell military-grade weapons to civilians, or just not sell AR-15s to domestic abusers who have been investigated by the FBI for terrorist connections and threats. I am furious and feel powerless. I beg you to stand up for me, my family, everyone who has ever lost family or friends to senseless gun violence, and for our society as a whole, which we are currently failing to protect. Enough is enough. That is from a young person who lives in Danbury, Connecticut. And it summarizes the feeling of powerlessness and helplessness and fury that Americans all across the country feel. Just to give you one example, I understand that in the last 96 hours, 500,000 people have signed a petition in favor of banning assault weapons. 500,000 people just in 96 hours in a petition circulated by MoveOn.org. Assault weapons are designed for one purpose: to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. They are combat hardened and tested and used. They are military-style assault weapons, AR-15. And as some of our colleagues have said, most hunters would not use them to shoot deer or other animals. And yet they are sold freely. Our request, our ask, is a much more limited one than even assault weapons. As much as they need to be banned in terms of new sales, we're simply saying don't sell those weapons to somebody who is on a terrorist watch list, somebody who is under investigation for potentially being supported and funded and maybe educated and trained by one of our adversaries or enemies abroad, like ISIS. And don't sell those kinds of weapons or any others to anyone without a background check, because they may fit that category or the other prohibited categories that are already in the law. Simply a means of enforcing the law. These proposals are really relatively modest, and so are the others that this young person has advocated that we adopt. Obvious and basic safeguards, to quote him. or her obvious and basic safeguards to gun ownership, such as universal background checks, CDC research into gun violence, limiting magazine capacity, restriction of gun ownership to domestic abusers and people on terrorist watch lists, to name a few. All of them should be adopted. We're asking for two. We're asking for votes. We're asking for action. And we're saying no more business as usual. Connecticut also had a connection to Orlando. A 37-year-old young woman named Kimberly Morris, educated in Torrington, Connecticut at the Torrington High School, and then at Post University in Waterbury, Connecticut. Kimberly Morris was known as a, quote, scrappy player, end quote, according to Charlie McSpirit, the Torrington High School's former athletic director. He can still remember Morris because she, quote, played the game to her fullest. She was, quote, a tenacious, end quote, small forward on the basketball team as well at Post University in Waterbury. Her near teammate Norval Benning, who played for the men's team, said, quote, she didn't let nobody push her around. Mr. Benning said, she was 37 years old. She's among the older of the victims who were killed in Orlando. What is so striking about the biographies of these young men and women is how young they are, how much of their lives they had ahead. Not as young as the 6-year-olds gunned down in Sandy Hook, those 20 beautiful children. But Kimberly, like those children, had her whole life ahead. So my question to my colleague is whether Connecticut still feels the impact and whether Connecticut wants us to act at a national level as well as the nation.
Thank the Senator for the question. Connecticut is still reeling to this day. Newtown is a community that has not recovered. And Connecticut wants us to act not just because they don't understand the inaction of this place, but because they've seen the benefit of stronger gun laws. Connecticut's legislature responded in a bipartisan way. Republicans and Democrats came together and passed legislation that banned dangerous assault weapons, that extended out background checks to more sales. And we've seen an immediate diminution in the number of gun crimes in our state. We've seen an immediate impact on the safety of residents. And so people in Connecticut want us to act because they acted like grown-ups in Connecticut. The minority leader of the state Senate, who wanted to run for governor, put his political future in peril by sitting down at the table and negotiating a compromise. And he stands by it today because that compromise saved lives. And so the people of Connecticut want us to act, Senator Blumenthal, and that's the reason that we're here today. Senator Blumenthal, if I could, I would just note for a moment before I hand it over to Senator Casey. When one of our colleagues had a moment to hold the floor for an extended period of time, he read a story to his kids who were at home. I actually didn't know this was going to occur, but my oldest little boy just showed up in the gallery. A, you're supposed to be in bed. B, I'm sorry that I missed pizza night. And C, I hope that you'll understand someday why we're doing this. Why we have been standing here for 8 hours trying to fight to make our country a safer and better place. And why sometimes, even if you don't get everything that you want, trying hard trying and trying and trying to do the right thing is ultimately just as important as getting the outcome in the end. So go to bed. But this is, for those of us who are parents, deeply, deeply personal. This is about protecting not just every kid in this country, but our kids personally. Senator Casey, I yield to you for a question without yielding control of the floor.
I want to thank Senator Murphy, and I'll extend that gratitude in a moment, but
too, so I shouldn't, he didn't come alone, by the way, so.
I want to thank anyone within the sound of my voice related to Senator Murphy. But my question is a basic one, but I think it's fundamental to his efforts. I'll address Senator Murphy and say your efforts and the efforts of those you've worked with, not only today, but on a lot of other days. Senator Blumenthal, who's with you today and working so hard on these issues, and Senator Booker, the three of you have been, if there's a way to express inspiration beyond just using that terminology, I'd like to hear it, because it's been an inspiration. My basic question is this, and I'll ask you to hold your answer for just a couple of minutes. My question is, how do you stay focused? How do you stay inspired to continue this fight, which for you has been not just hours long or days long or weeks, it's literally been years. But I'll ask forbearance for just a couple of minutes to give you a sense of part of the motivation that I have. I'm holding here, this is it'll be difficult to see from far away, but this is a one-page tear sheet from the Wall Street Journal dated Monday, December 17th, 2012. It says at the top, Connecticut school shooting, and then the headline below that, but in larger letters, is Shattered Lives. I obviously won't read it all, but this has been on my desk since that week. And you can see it's a bit yellowed, and every story here has an element of inspiration that is almost unimaginable. And I mention that because I'm from Pennsylvania. I don't represent the state of Connecticut, but this tragedy in Connecticut, Newtown, Sandy Hook Elementary School, stays with all of us for different reasons. Maybe because some of us are parents, maybe because we were struck by the gravity, the enormity, and the brutality of that crime on what so many of us have called that awful day. But I'll tell you, I don't think I've been as affected by a news event other than 9/11 in my life, and certainly not one never affected in the way that it had a connection to what I would do and how I would vote. So this tragedy in Newtown in 2012 directly affected the way I would vote, changed my thinking in so many different ways, which I won't walk through all of that tonight. But as much as these stories of these children inspired me then and continue to inspire me, I don't want to add another set of stories to my desk or keep adding to the chronicle of suffering and the chronicle of murder and destruction that gun violence will leave us with. Today, the Washington Post, and I'll just open this up for illustrative purposes, had one page and then another page, and they needed 2 pages, obviously, because of the number of victims. I didn't count, but if that's not 49, it's close to 49, and each of them has a story as well. So just as the children whose stories were summarized in the Wall Street Journal in 2012, today's Washington Post, and I'm sure many other papers have these stories. And we don't have time to go through every story, but I was inspired by the lives of those children, what they meant to their families, what their life meant to their community, how they, even in their very young lives, had already begun to achieve significant things in their life, either by making their sisters and brothers happier or comforting their sisters and brothers and family and friends. And I'm sure the same will be said of those who lost their lives in Orlando. Let me just give you two examples for in the interest of time. This is on page 811 of the Washington Post today, one of the many vignettes. I mentioned earlier today Akira Monet Murray, 18 years old. She happened to be from Philadelphia. I talked about her earlier today. Third in her class, on her way to a basketball scholarship, just happened to be in Orlando, Florida. She was killed. A remarkable young woman. I wish I knew her, but she's had just graduated from West Catholic in Philadelphia. But here's someone as well who died in Orlando. Brenda Lee Marquez McCool, 49 years old, one of the oldest on these two pages. Many of them listed, as many people here know, were 25 and 21 and 18 and 24 and 22 and on and on. But here's what the first two lines of this vignette about Brenda Lee Marquez McCool, a two-time cancer survivor. McCool was first diagnosed with cancer about 8 years ago. And this is her ex-husband, Robert Presley, said, quote, "The doctor gave her a year to live. She lived 8 until this nonsense," unquote. She lived 8 years after a diagnosis of cancer. So that, her life and her fight to overcome cancer should be a reminder of us that this is a long fight. And she lost her life ultimately, but she beat cancer for a long time, even though she lost her life this weekend. I'll give you one more, and there's so many more, and we just don't have time tonight to go through all. Shane Evan Tomlinson, 33. He was working that night, playing in a band, and then he left there to go to the club and to be able to relax a little bit after working. But he was a member of an all-male gospel choir at House of Blues in Orlando. Again, 33 years old. So I don't want to keep adding to this chronicle. No, none of us want. We all want to figure out a way to make progress on this issue, to finally say to ourselves that as Americans, we can come together and take even incremental steps, but I think for this week would be significant, as both all three senators, Senator Murphy, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Booker, have reminded us. What we're asking for here is a model of reasonableness. We're asking for a simple solution to a very discrete but horrific problem. If you're too dangerous to go out and get on an airplane, if we've made that determination, why would you be allowed to have a firearm? Why would a terrorist or potential terrorist be allowed to have a firearm? Let's solve that one problem. And then, of course, a problem that we tried to solve in 2013, background checks, which at last count is about a 90-10 issue in the United States of America. So this is a reasonable and sensible set of requests, just two in number. I could go on with others, but I won't. Let me just conclude with Sandy Hook for a moment. We all know the horror of what happened there and the impact it had on all of our lives. But Senator Booker reminded us yesterday that in so many communities, so many inner cities in America, they have large numbers of gun deaths every single week, and in some communities almost every single day. I won't mention a list of cities or communities because it would not be exhaustive. But I think people know that. And we've got to figure out a way to stay focused on those communities, even as we focus on the horror and the gravity and the dimensions of what happened in Orlando or Newtown or so many other places. But let's think about this just for a moment before I, at long last, ask my question or ask it to be answered for Senator Murphy. How about school shootings since Sandy Hook? What do we find there? Since Sandy Hook, a gun has been fired on school grounds nearly once a week, for a total of 188 school shootings, including several in my home state of Pennsylvania, according to data compiled by Everytown for Gun Safety. So this is happening weekly since Newtown. It's not as if we have these events and we focus on them, and then the problem recedes as we recede in our actions or lack of actions, in our focus, in our determination, in our sense of urgency. The problem does not go away. The problem is not going away. If anything, it's growing in dimension. Just look at the data on how this problem has grown since the 1960s and 70s. This didn't happen in those days. It didn't even happen much in the 80s. But you look at 1990 forward, and you see incident after incident. In 2000 and forward, it goes on and on. So if anything, it's accelerating at a pace that no one in this body should be content about. So that means that every single week, there's some either school child or school student. This goes all the way to, obviously, to colleges and universities. So every single week, some group of Americans who happen to be children or young adults are in a school setting of one kind or another. And they're either the direct victim or the victim who lives through that horror and has the imprint of that horror for the rest of their lives. So that's the reality. So anyone who thinks that this is just a random occurrence, go to a school in a lot of places and talk to people in schools, and go to our cities, and I think we could all learn a lot. I want to just mention a few more statistics because we were talking about children. Numbers don't ever paint the right picture, but they're instructive on a night like tonight. I live in a state which has a proud tradition of support for the Second Amendment, and I mean really strong, like maybe no other state in the country, maybe one or two others, but not many. A strong tradition of hunting in sport. And hunting is almost a part of not just the culture of our state, but part of family life. Fathers and sons. Fathers and sons go out and hunt, and I'm sure fathers and daughters or mothers and daughters. It's part of growing up in some communities. And they go out and hunt, and they participate in a tradition. They work to do it safely. They do a lot of training. They pass on from one generation to another, not just the experience, but the rules and the way to do things. We have as strong a tradition as any in the country. By some estimates, we have about 1 million gun owners. I don't know where that puts us in the rankings, but it's no lower than second or third or fourth in the country. So we have a lot of people in our state that not only value the Second Amendment, but the benefits of that amendment for their lives are significant because they get to own a gun to hunt. In some cases, obviously, for many people, to protect themselves or their families. Here's what the numbers tell us about just gun violence in a state like Pennsylvania as it relates to children, only. According to the Pennsylvania Trauma Systems Foundation, every year about 400 children, meaning individuals In that same year, 2013, the same year as Newtown, 1,670 children under 18 died by gunshot, and an additional 9,718 were injured. So in just 1 year, in one state, 1,670 children died by gunshot, 9,718 injured. That's the reality. So when we consider the gravity of this problem in our cities, in communities of all kinds, and most tragically in Orlando, Florida, we know it's a problem of great significance and dimension and complexity. We know this is not easy to solve, but we know our country has faced huge challenges in the past. We're the country that won World War II. Without our participation, the Allies could never have won. That's who America is. That was a pretty tough problem, trying to defeat the Axis powers and take on these powerful military machines. But we figured out a way to do that as a nation. We all came together. We all came together after 9/11. Complicated problem involving rights, having to stand in line and say, I'm going to participate in this process to make our airlines safe, so we don't have airplanes flying into buildings. That was a big problem. But we did not surrender to the terrorists after 9/11. We came together and figured out a solution to a problem. We haven't solved the terrorism problem. We've certainly solved the problem of preventing terrorists from taking an airplane and flying it into a building, not only to kill thousands of people, but to create untold kinds of fear. So where does that leave us with the children of Sandy Hook? Well, I'll take another day to read some of the stories. But let me just leave you with one thought, and I want to ask Senator Murphy a question after I read this. One of the children killed that day, and every child's story is worthy of mention, but in the interest of time, I'll just highlight, and it will be a highlight of one. Caroline Praviti. Caroline was 6 when she lost her life at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Among other things, they wrote that, quote, Caroline loved to draw and dance. Her smile brought happiness to everyone she touched. That's what her obituary read at the age of 6. She'll be remembered for accompanying a nervous kindergartner on the school bus. Caroline, a first grader, sat with Karen Dreyer's son, Logan, on the bus each day. Quote, this is what Mrs. Dreyer said about Caroline. She sat with her son, Logan, so that he wasn't scared, unquote. That's what a grateful mother said about little Caroline and about what she did before she died. Now what does that mean for tonight? Well, if little Caroline at the age of 6 could comfort someone younger than she was on the bus every day, knowing he was afraid, knowing he was scared or worried about what was happening in his life, a kindergartner on a bus. If Caroline could do that and show not just a measure of courage, but really a measure of responsibility. She took responsibility in her young life to help solve the one problem that one of her classmates, or almost classmates, one of her friends was having. I think we should take inspiration from Caroline's sense of responsibility. She thought apparently it was her duty to help someone younger than she was and to give them comfort, to give a measure of security. In her young life, in that little world that she was, she figured out a way to be responsible. I hope that people across this chamber will do more than just kind of casually review these amendments and casually think about this issue and just stay in your lane, which the lane is, for a number of people here, you know, the usual response, which is no laws will change this. I'm glad we didn't say that after 9/11, by the way. Good thing we didn't do that as a nation. No laws will change this. No policy will change this. But I hope, in light of what Caroline has taught us, that we will all be responsible and serious and sober about what we're trying to do here. And we'll examine our conscience, to use an old expression. Is there something that you can do with your vote this week, next month, or next year that will help solve a part of this problem? Because this is a big problem which is not going away. And every one of our lives is going to be affected by it in some way or another going forward. Many of us have seen too much of this in our states and in our communities. So finally, Senator Murphy, I will ask you this question. I won't guess at the answer, but in light of some of those stories, and you know the stories, that you know the families personally, I do not. How do you stay focused on a goal, the goal that you're pursuing and we're talking about tonight, and how do you stay inspired in the midst of and in the absence of significant progress?
I thank you, Senator Casey, for that question, and I thank you for how you've conducted yourself since the shooting in Sandy Hook. I was remarking to Senator Warner on the same topic, but it was really you and Senator Warner who, in the days following the shooting, came out and said, we need to engage, we need to change something, and we're willing to change our minds or our level of advocacy. You were one of the most persuasive voices on behalf of the families of Sandy Hook in the days and weeks following, and you've been so generous to meet with them, as have many of my colleagues when they come here. And in answer to your question, I go back to those families. So probably the worst day that I've had legislatively while I've been here was the day in which that background checks bill failed. Now, remember, it didn't really fail. It got the majority of this Senate to vote for it, but it failed because of a Republican-led filibuster. And I want to thank Representative Swalwell and Representative Gabbard for joining us on the floor today. I really appreciate our friends from the House being here. And I remember standing with them after that bill failed, and they whispered to me some version of a very simple idea. They said, we aren't advocates for 4 months. We're advocates for 40 years, right? A tragedy like Sandy Hook or like Orlando or like Aurora, it fundamentally reorders the lives of those who are affected. And the reason why I think this Congress has been focused on this question perpetually since Sandy Hook is because those families continue to come here, continue to show up at our doors, continue to press. And the simple answer to your question is, as long as those families aren't going to give up, then we're not going to give up. And there's no more articulate spokesman in the Senate for children than you, Senator Casey. And I have a feeling that so long as children's lives are at risk because we are choosing to allow for dangerous criminals and potential terrorists to get weapons, that you're not going to stop either. And I appreciate your being a big part of our effort on the floor today. With that, I would yield the floor for a question without relinquishing control of it to Senator King.
Senator, I have a series of questions and some comments. First, I come from a predominantly rural state. A very high number of gun owners, a very low rate of gun crime. What you're talking about here today of adding the terrorist watch list as one of the elements of the background check and covering the non-covered parts of gun sales, online gun shows, will that have any practical effect on the gun owners in Maine?
It won't have any practical effect on the law-abiding gun owners in Maine, and that's who you and I are talking to. The only effect that it would have is upon criminals or felons that are attempting to circumvent our laws and get weapons by avoiding criminal background checks. The only effect that it would have is if there were individuals on Maine who were the subject of terrorist investigations, they would be prevented from buying weapons. But of course, even those individuals, if they thought that they were on the list for the wrong reasons, would have a process to grieve that. But for law-abiding citizens in Maine or Connecticut or Pennsylvania or New Jersey, this law has no impact on them.
It'll have no practical effect. They'll still be able to buy guns in either place. They'd have to go through the instant background check and the law that as if they were a felon or something like that, then they would be prevented. But other than that, this isn't going to have any practical effect on the law-abiding gun owners in Maine.
It will have no effect on law-abiding gun owners in Maine or anywhere else. This has nothing to do with those individuals.
I want to take a slightly different view than I've heard today on the issue of terrorism. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon that we're in session, we meet upstairs in an enclosed room. And ever since I've been here in January of 2013, the subject, in one way or another, has been terrorism, has been the threats that this country is facing around the world. And what's happened in the last 4 years is a subtle change in the nature of that threat. And when we first came, we were talking about Al-Qaeda. We were talking about plots. We were talking about people coming here using airplanes, otherwise penetrating this country from abroad. What's happened is that the terrorist threat has become homegrown. In fact, there's even a term for it of homegrown extremists or local terrorists. And ISIS is here. Every place there is a computer with an internet connection, ISIS is there. And people like the shooter in Orlando about terrorist acts and who they are inspiring to these acts can walk out and get a gun without any hesitation as long as they don't violate one of the terms of the current law. The other piece of this that I think is important is that the current law that has the list of prohibitions, mental illness, felony, domestic violence, there are 9, was passed in 1993. The world is enormously and fundamentally different than it was in 1993. In 1993, we'd barely heard of Al-Qaeda. There was no ISIS. There was very little threat or acknowledgement or understanding of domestic terrorism whatsoever. But now we're in terrorism 2.0. And what happened in Orlando is exactly what we've been hearing about in the Intelligence Committee, what's been predicted by all of our intelligence officials, what many of us have been talking about. It's the nightmare scenario, an American who is radicalized online, who goes out and gets a gun and kills 50 people. That is the hardest threat to stop. Because there's no plot, there's no email trail, there are very little phone calls, there's nothing, it's hard for our intelligence community to track someone like that. But if we have some knowledge of them, if they're in our database, to me it just makes common sense that that should be added to the list of disqualifications for buying guns. And this is no threat to anybody who's not on such a list. And I understand, and you can please comment, that the legislation that we're talking about has a constitutional escape hatch for people who are wrongly on the list or whose names are mixed up. And they will have an opportunity to protest that listing. and have their names expunged if they can make the case that there was something wrong with them being on the list. Is that correct?
It is correct. It is correct, and that's an important facet of the amendment that Senator Feinstein has introduced. But it's also important, as we remarked earlier, perhaps when you were on the floor, Senator King, to understand the scope of this. We're talking about a very small number of sales that actually would be affected. In 2015, thanks to a report that Senator Feinstein released, we know that in that year, there were only about 215 sales at gun stores to individuals that were on the terrorist watch list. So it's a very small number of sales that we're talking about in the first place.
But if someone said, well, if that's such a small number, why are we bothering? Because it only takes one to kill 50 people.
Correct.
And that's really the essence of what you're talking about. Now, as I understand it, there are two parts of what we're talking about today. And by the way, you're not talking about assault weapons ban, you're not talking about magazine controls, you're not talking about any of those things. We're really talking about two things. Terrorist watch list, if you're on the list, you can't buy a gun. No fly, no buy. The second is to fill the loopholes in the background check system, because, as I understand your argument, if we say if you're on the watch list you can't buy a gun, but there's this gaping 40% loophole where you could get a gun without any check whatsoever, then it doesn't matter. Anybody, the felon, anybody can get a gun under that circumstance. Is that the logical progression?
That's exactly right. And I think you very smartly referred back to the initiation of the background check system, in which no one was contemplating a terrorist watch list or a no-fly list existing. Well, that's the same thing with Internet sales. That's the same thing with armlist.com. It's the same thing with gun shows. Back when we passed the background checks law, the vast majority of gun sales was done at bricks and mortar stores. What has happened is that sales have migrated into other forums, especially online. And so in all of these respects, I think you're accurately pointing out that all we are really seeking to do is to have the law and the initial intent of it catch up with the trajectory of time.
And I find it hard to believe that if we were debating that law in 1993 under the current circumstances, that some cognizance wouldn't have been taken of the risk of domestic terrorism.
I don't think there would have been any question that that category would have been included. That is probably why 80% of Americans support the adoption of this amendment or some version of it.
By the way, I would mention that since you have been on the floor today, 10 people have been murdered with guns. It's about one an hour.
Yeah.
Since the Orlando shooting, 100 people, twice as many as in Orlando, have been murdered with guns. So we're talking about Orlando, but we're also talking about people all over the country, mostly innocent people, sometimes people victims of domestic violence. And we're talking about, not about taking guns away from people, we're talking about keeping people who shouldn't have them from getting guns. And I've never met a gun owner who doesn't agree that that's just a common sense restriction.
Yeah.
Do you view this in any way as a violation of the Second Amendment?
Senator Udall was on the floor earlier, and he said somebody called his office earlier today asking why we were debating the Second Amendment today. And, of course, the answer to that is we're not debating the Second Amendment. There's actually nothing about this debate that's relevant to the Second Amendment because the Second Amendment is clear. As the Supreme Court has stated, an individual has a right to own a firearm. But as that same court very clearly stated in an opinion by Justice Scalia himself, that right is not absolute. The Congress has the ability to say that there are some weapons that should be out of bounds, or there are some individuals who are so dangerous that they shouldn't own weapons. And so even the most conservative jurists on the Supreme Court have held very plainly that the Second Amendment allows for the Congress or for state legislatures to decide that there are certain individuals, felons, people that have been convicted of violent crimes, or individuals that we suspect of terrorist activities that shouldn't buy a weapon. And of course, as we remarked earlier, if you go into any gun club in Maine or Connecticut, that is what people are going to believe in those forums as well. They believe that law-abiding citizens should be able to get any weapons that they want, by and large, but they don't believe that criminals should be able to buy weapons. That's a view held by gun owners and non-gun owners alike, because everyone accepts that it is in keeping with the Second Amendment.
But don't you think that one of the problems with this debate, as it's evolved over the past few years, it's become a kind of either-or?
Right.
If you're for the Second Amendment, there are no limitations whatsoever. And if you talk about limitations, you're against the Second Amendment. Do you accept that characterization?
I think you're exactly right. And I think this has become an either-or debate in so many different respects. I'm so glad you're weaving together this question of how we respond to terrorism and how we protect Americans from the consequences of loose gun laws, because there's also this juxtaposition in which these terrorist attacks are either about the fight against ISIS or they're about our loose gun laws. And they're about both. And this shooting in Orlando is about a whole host of other subjects as well. And so I think we have tried to stay true to the complexity of this question on the floor during this time. We are not suggesting that what we are proposing is going to solve the problem. But we do have to get out of this paradigm in which, if you're a supporter of the Second Amendment, you can't support any restrictions on individuals, whether or not they're on the terrorist watch list, to obtain guns.
Well, this solution that's being proposed, even if it only prevents one person, that could be 50 lives or 100 lives. And I think that's important. By the way, it's a dirty trick, Senator, to quote Justice Scalia on the subject. And he did make it clear in the Heller Amendment, as you point out, that the Second Amendment, as the First Amendment or any of the amendments, are not absolute. People say the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting speech. But you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's established law. And Justice Scalia in the Heller decision said the same thing about the Second Amendment. It's not absolute. There are limitations that can be placed upon it, particularly in the transfer of firearms, and I think that's what we're talking about here. So I commend the senator, and I believe that what we're talking about, and let me go back to the Intelligence Committee for a minute. It took me 2 or 3 months. Maybe I'm a slow learner, but I'm sitting in the Intelligence Committee, and I finally had 2 really visceral insights. One was, we're the only people watching the intelligence community. That we've got this large apparatus, and we've got these small committees in the House and the Senate, and we're the only people watching. That's not relevant to this debate, but that was an important realization that imposed upon me what I thought was an extraordinary responsibility to pay close attention to what these agencies are doing. The second insight was that the fundamental role of the Intelligence Committee, and I would argue the fundamental role of this body, is to constantly monitor and calibrate the tension that exists between 2 fundamental provisions of the Constitution, in this case 3. The first is in the preamble. Fundamental reason that this government was formed in the first place: to ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense. That's the essence of any government. Fundamental, sacred responsibility. And then we have the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, Fourth and Fifth Amendment that have issues of privacy, issues of gun ownership, and we have to constantly balance and calibrate those provisions based upon technology and reality, circumstances, facts. And we have a new set of facts. We are facing a threat today in the United States that's different than what we have ever faced before, where we have people who are being motivated from abroad mostly, but are in our society, in our country. This fellow in Orlando was an American citizen, born here. And we've got to take cognizance of that. We've got to take account of that reality. If we don't, we're failing, it seems to me, our fundamental responsibility under the preamble of the Constitution to provide for the common defense. That's what the people of America expect us to do, to keep them safe. And this is simply one piece of the armor that we can provide to keep the people of America safe. I would conclude with a question to the senator. Is there any hope of getting this accomplished? Where are we? Why is this so hard? This seems to be a common sense response. And I read a quote from the NRA today that said, "We believe that terrorists should not have guns." So is there room for discussion, for compromise? Do you feel that there is an opportunity here to get to a place where we can respond to this new threat that's facing us without in any way compromising the values of the Second Amendment?
I thank the Senator for guiding us towards that compromise, because it has to be there. And we are, on this issue, we are speaking the same language. Frankly, on background checks, we tend to speak the same language. We both say, Republicans and Democrats, that we don't want criminals to get guns. We both say that we don't want terrorists to get guns, and yet we have been unable to meet in the middle. My understanding is that the majority has a concern about the ability of individuals who shouldn't be on these lists to get off the list. So do we. We have no less interest in due process than they do. And so we want to bring these issues to a vote on the floor, but our preference is to bring a compromise measure that can pass and get the support of both sides. I know that we've had Senator Toomey and some others come to the floor today and suggest that there's some work to be done to get a compromise, and my hope is that we can get there. If we can't, then let's at least take the vote and let the American people see where we stand.
But my understanding is the amendment as proposed does provide specific process whereby a person who believes that they are wrongfully on the list, wrongfully denied the opportunity to purchase a firearm, they have the opportunity to contest that, to have it litigated, and have it resolved in a reasonably prompt manner.
And I think that has been the difficulty in finding this compromise. The existing text gives the ability already for anyone who believes that they are on the list wrongly to get off that list. That's why I said that we are just as concerned with that, and the underlying amendment that we have proposed, that Senator Feinstein has proposed, does exactly that. It gives an escape hatch for anyone that is on that list wrongly.
One of the odd things about this debate is that if this had been 15 years ago, I don't think we'd be even having this debate. This would have been done, background checks was generally uncontroversial. And if we'd had the terrorist threat, I can't believe it wouldn't have been. We've got domestic violence on there. How about terrorism violence? That should be part of this as well, and that's all you're really proposing. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's only controversial here, Senator King. It's not controversial out in the American public. They want this done, by and large. So we've created a controversy that really doesn't exist in the living rooms and social halls of this country.
I thank the Senator, and thank you for your answers, and thank you for your leadership on this issue.
I think it's really important. Thank you, Senator King. I think it's really important that we have the diversity of our caucus represented as part of this discussion today. Senator King and Senator Donnelly, both strong supporters of the Second Amendment, and I'm glad to yield the floor for a question without losing my right to the floor to Senator Donnelly.
Will the senator from Connecticut yield for a question?
Will.
Like all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I was sick when I learned of the tragic shooting in Orlando. Since Sunday, like so many people, my thoughts have been with the families and with the friends of the victims, with the LGBT community, with the people of Orlando, with all Americans who are mourning the loss of loved ones at the hands of senseless gun violence. My thoughts are also with the parents across our nation who have to explain to our kids, how can something like this happen in our country? We were elected in this chamber to do a job, to discuss issues, to debate them, and to vote on legislation that makes our communities and our country safer. I came to the floor tonight to participate in this discussion because we have a job to do and we have action to take. Senator Murphy, I want to thank you for leading this effort. I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. I'm also someone who believes it's reasonable for all of us to consider smart and responsible ways to reduce gun violence. Those things are not in opposition to each other. Since I've come to the Senate, we've talked about mass shootings in Orlando, in San Bernardino, in Charleston, and in the senator's home state of Newtown, Connecticut. The truth is, there's gun violence across this country every single day. No state is immune, including my home state of Indiana. Every victim of gun violence is someone's mom, or someone's dad, or someone's sister, or someone's brother, or someone's son, or someone's daughter, or someone's husband, or someone's wife. And those lives are destroyed. There are bipartisan proposals we can consider today that can make a difference. They won't solve every problem, but we can save lives. We can start by considering the bipartisan proposal by Senators Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey that strengthens our background check system to help prevent criminals and individuals with serious mental illnesses from getting guns. This legislation requires background checks for all commercial gun sales, whether they're at a store, or whether they're at a gun show, or whether they are online. We should also debate and pass bipartisan legislation that denies firearm sales to known or suspected terrorists. This is simple American common sense. This is what the American people expect of us. This is what we were elected to do. If a person is on a terrorist watch list, they shouldn't be able to buy a gun. It is that simple and that uncomplicated. It's time to do our job. To do our job as members of Congress to confront the serious problem of gun violence in our country. To debate our options and to work to find solutions that help keep all Americans safe, to protect our individual rights. The members of this body, we have differences, but we shouldn't have differences on this. We have also demonstrated that we can find common ground at critical times. I'm confident every member of this body agrees we should keep weapons out of the hands of criminals, terrorists, people with mental illnesses. This should not be controversial. I urge all my colleagues to come together on behalf of the American people who have blessed us with this opportunity to serve here and to stand up for them and to vote on these proposals. It is the very least we can do for those families, for the people we represent, and for the serious obligation and responsibility they have given to us to do these things. They expect us to do our job. It's time for us to step up to the plate. And with all that in mind, I have a question for my good friend, the senator from Connecticut. And the question is this: Senator, don't we owe it to the victims of Orlando, the victims from your home state in Newtown, the victims of Charleston, and to the victims of gun violence in all our states, to have a vote on these proposals, which are bipartisan in every single way?
Senator Donnelly, I think that last phrase is the most important. They're bipartisan in every single way. We've had bipartisan support for these proposals on the floor of the Senate, but frankly, more importantly, in Indiana and Connecticut, there is bipartisan support. Whether you are talking to progressive Democrats or rock-rib Republicans, they all are of the consensus position that if you can't fly because we have deemed you to be a terrorist threat, then you probably shouldn't be able to buy an assault weapon. and that if you are a criminal, that it shouldn't really matter whether you walk into a gun show or a gun store, you shouldn't be able to buy a weapon. And so I think you've put it perfectly, which is that in every way, these are bipartisan proposals. And it's incumbent upon us to, at the very least, show the American public where the Senate stands on these issues. Show the people of Indiana and Connecticut and Illinois where senators stand on these two simple questions that have bipartisan grassroots support in this country.
Let me ask you one more question, which is this. Senator, do you think we are underestimating, in this body, that the senators are underestimating the common sense of the American people? That they know terrorists shouldn't be allowed to have these weapons. That they know it's a danger to our kids, to our families. That we would do great credit to the American people to have the faith in them, to believe in them, that they are ready to take these steps. They're ready to see their senators take these steps and to stand with us, because we all love our children. We all love our families. We all want to make sure that when they go out to be with their friends, they come home safe that night. That for all of our families, whether Republican or Democrat, that or most important, we're not red or blue. We're red, we're white, and we're blue. We're all Americans. We are one team. We are in this together. And doesn't it seem to make sense that here we ought to be able to reflect the will of the American people? And I think the American people are ready for this, Senator, don't you?
It's a political issue here. It's not a political issue anywhere else. And you talk about, I think, a very apt description of our underestimation of the common sense of the American people. I also think we underestimate our ability to fundamentally address the fear that exists today about the next terrorist attack. I think if we were able to come together and pass these two simple measures, it would be a show of faith with the American people that we get it, that we understand how anxious they are, how fearful they are, how angry they are. And there is a salve to the wound that could come if we were able to come together and act. It's not just that it would make a practical difference, stopping potential terrorists from getting guns, but it would have a psychological impact on people. So I think you're right that we underestimate the common sense of the American public, but I also think we underestimate our ability to do something meaningful to address what is a very legitimate anxiety in the public, having watched San Bernardino to Orlando. I thank the gentleman, and I yield to Senator Durbin for a question without losing the right to the floor.
I would like to direct a question to the senator from Connecticut. First, I would like to acknowledge that the senator from Connecticut took the floor about 10 hours ago and has stood here with his colleague, the senator from New Jersey, Senator Booker, and many others who have joined him during the course of this day. Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut was also here. I'd like to ask a few questions and then ask you to react to a news story that just came out today. I think it's important for us from time to time to remind those who are just starting to follow this debate why we are here, and particularly why you, Senator, have been on the floor for 10 hours straight. This is unusual in the Senate. It is technically known as a filibuster when one member takes the floor and doesn't yield the floor. And it's done for a variety of reasons. It's been done throughout the history of this chamber. But I hope we can make it clear from the outset of why we're doing it today, why you are leading it, and why we are joining you today, why this is an important message that we are trying to send across America from one coast to the other, and include the islands of Hawaii. That we are dealing with this because what happened in Orlando has really focused America on gun violence and the terrible tragedy that occurred there with 49 deaths and almost another 50 who were injured, seriously injured, as a result of this gunman who turned his guns loose on these poor people who gathered at this nightclub. I'd like to ask the senator from Connecticut, at the risk of repeating himself, which is part of what we do here, but at the risk of making sure that those who are following the debate, if he would tell us the two issues that he believes bring us together in this effort, this common effort, late this evening on the floor of the Senate.
I thank the senator for continuing to focus us on why we're here. We're frankly not here just to talk. We're here to try to bring some resolution to this debate and to move on the consideration of the CJS appropriations bill. We're asking for two votes on what could be consensus measures with respect to protecting Americans. One, we want to make sure that if you are on the terrorist watch list, if you are on the no-fly list, then you cannot buy a gun, that you are prohibited by law from buying a gun. No controversy about that in the American public. It would make a tremendous difference. Second, in order to make that provision truly effective, we need to make sure that no matter where you buy a gun, whether you buy it at a bricks and mortar store, online, or at a gun show, that you are subject to background checks. One of those provisions without the other doesn't protect us. Both of them together protect Americans from terrorist attack, protect the flow of illegal guns into communities like Chicago without having any effect on individuals' Second Amendment rights. If you are a law-abiding citizen in this country, the two measures that we are proffering for a vote on the Senate floor